They told us the Reformation was about faith, pure and simple. But what if I told you that wasn't the full story? What if it was really about money, power, and the world's first global financial empire? Welcome to the Chronology of Wealth, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. You see, before Martin, Luther even thought about nailing his thesis to a church door in 1517. The Catholic Church had already built something far greater, an empire of faith and finance, meticulously constructed on guilt, gold, and the very real fear of damnation. What do you think? Faith or fortune? At the dawn of the 16th century, Europe wasn't really ruled by kings. It was governed by creditors in robes. The church was the largest landowner on the entire continent. Its priests collected tithes, basically taxes, and its bishops often acted like seasoned bankers. And the popes. They lived like emperors, their lavish robes funded by the very peasants they simultaneously told to renounce all earthly wealth. Rome had become this incredibly efficient machine, perfectly designed to convert belief directly into revenue. Every single stage of life was taxable. Baptism, fee. Marriage, another fee. Death, you guessed it, a fee. Even your journey through the afterlife came with a price list. And then there were indulgences. These little slips of parchment, supposedly erasing sins, became the church's most profitable product. For the poor, they offered a glimmer of hope. For the rich, they were insurance against eternal damnation. For the church, they were pure, unadulterated cash flow. And Rome desperately needed that cash. Would you buy an indulgence today? Decades of relentless wars, lavish cours and these endless, incredibly ambitious building projects had completely drained the Vatican's coffers. Enter Pope Leox Ami hacking in it. He launched this massive campaign to fund his grandest vision, the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica. He called it a house of God, but let's be honest. It was also the world's most expensive investment in brand management, a towering cathedral designed to remind all of Europe who held the literal keys to heaven. To pay for it, the church essentially turned salvation into a financial instrument. A vast marketing campaign swept across Europe, led by flamboyant indulgence preachers. Their promise was simple: forgiveness in exchange for silver. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, they'd boom, the soul from purgatory springs. But here's the kicker, that money didn't stay in the towns where it was collected. It flowed south straight through powerful merchant banks, like the Fuggers, who conveniently managed the Vatican's finances directly into the deep pockets of Rome. It was an early, very sophisticated version of global finance, local extraction, incredibly centralized wealth. Does this sound familiar? Up in the German territories, resentment was boiling over. Towns were poor, wages were stagnant, and gold was literally vanishing. The church preached sacrifice, yet its leaders lived in marble palaces. Meanwhile, north of the Alps, the economy was rapidly transforming. Trade was expanding, literacy was on the rise, and a new, ambitious middle class was emerging: merchants, printers, bankers. These were people who believed in hard work, not in paying rent to salvation. But Rome's control was still absolute. When Spain and Portugal started exploring the Atlantic, Pope Alexander VI literally drew a line across the world map. In the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, he divided the entire globe between them. Set one decree written in Latin ink and sealed with papal gold effectively gave to Catholic empires ownership of the entire future. The rest of Europe was shut out, in modern terms. The Pope had just created the world's first global monopoly. Could a single entity do this today? And that monopoly made Rome even richer. The church collected tithes from colonial profits, blessed conquests, and took cuts from every single ship carrying silver from the New World, The Vatican didn't need to colonize. It just needed royalties. Faith had become infrastructure, a vast system of economic control stretching from Seville all the way to Saxony. The Pope crowned kings, arbitrated debts, approved loans, and even licensed mining operations. The Church's bankers financed monarchs at interest and then conveniently forgave their sins at a discount. By 1517, the system looked completely unshakable. But deep cracks were starting to form. Because in Wittenberg, a quiet scholar named Martin Luther had begun to see the Church's corruption not just as moral failure, but as structural rot. When indulgence sellers arrived in his city, trading forgiveness like some kind of franchise, he saw more than just greed. He saw a system utterly addicted to revenue, where faith was leveraged like credit. On October 31st, 1517, Luther famously nailed his 95 Theses to the church door. It wasn't just an act of defiance. It was a desperate audit. He wasn't initially calling for revolution. He was calling for reform. But within months, his pamphlet was copied, printed, and distributed like wildfire across Europe, an early viral campaign that no censorship could contain. The church tried to crush him, but they were too late. Why? Because technology had completely changed the game. The printing press, invented less than a century earlier, had shattered the Vatican's monopoly on information. Ideas could now travel faster than armies. And Luther's message hit like an economic contagion. He accused the church of extorting the poor, of turning faith into a ruthless business, of selling a salvation they literally couldn't deliver. And when he declared that every man is his own priest, he didn't just decentralize theology, he completely decentralized the economy of belief. What's the printing press of our time? German princes saw their chance. Breaking from Rome meant keeping their wealth. No more papal taxes. No more gold draining south. No more Italian bankers pulling the strings. They supported Luther not primarily for doctrine, but for dividends. The Reformation spread not because of faith alone, but because it was undeniably profitable. The Church had overplayed its hand. It had converted belief into a product and then inflated it beyond all control. The spiritual credit bubble burst. By 1521, Rome had excommunicated Luther. But the contagion couldn't be stopped. Entire nations began to realize they didn't need Rome to believe in God or to control their own money. And across the Channel, one king was watching very, very closely. While Luther fought Rome with words, Henry VIII would fight it with law and take the Reformation's logic to its inevitable conclusion. If the Church could sell salvation, then the state could sell God. Henry VIII's rebellion didn't begin with theology. It began with frustration, the kind that only a king could afford. He wanted an annulment, not a reformation. But when the Pope refused to grant it, Henry realized something deeper. The Church wasn't just denying him a wife. It was denying him sovereignty. England had been paying tribute to Rome for centuries. Gold flowed south in the form of papal taxes, tithes, and indulgences. The Pope controlled appointments, owned vast lands, and meddled in royal affairs under the banner of divine authority. So when Henry passed the Act of Supremacy in 1534, declaring himself head of the Church of England, it wasn't simply an act of faith. It was an act of financial rebellion, a declaration of independence from Rome's balance sheet. By severing ties with the Vatican, Henry didn't just divorce Catherine of Aragon. He divorced debt. Overnight, England stopped sending money to Rome, every papal fee, every indulgence, every ounce of English gold that once funded the Vatican's marble splendour stayed within the kingdom. And then came the real transformation, not moral, but monetary. Between 1536 and 1541, Henry ordered the dissolution of the monasteries, seizing every abbey, priory, and convent in the realm. The Catholic Church had owned roughly a third of all English land. Henry took it all. The wealth of the church became the wealth of the crown. Monks were expelled, altars stripped, chalices melted, relics sold. The sacred became liquid assets. Henry sold much of this land to loyal nobles and merchants, effectively turning faith into capital and religion into real estate. What began as a personal crisis had become one of the greatest wealth transfers in European history. Is there anything the state can't monetize? The result was not just the birth of Anglicanism, it was the birth of fiscal nationalism. England had replaced the universal church with a state-run one. The power of Rome was replaced by the power of the king. The church had been the first global monopoly. Now the state was. And the Reformation, in England at least, was less about theology and more about control, who held the right to profit from faith. Henry's new Church of England became the prototype of a system where the sacred and the sovereign worked in tandem, where belief became a tool of governance. But the consequences reached far beyond the pulpit. When Henry cut ties with Rome, he also freed England from the Pope's geopolitical decrees, especially the Treaty of Tordesillas, which had granted Spain and Portugal exclusive rights to the New World. Under papal law, England had been forbidden to explore or claim foreign lands. After the break, those restrictions vanished. The English flag could finally follow the gold. Within decades, privateers like Francis Drake were raiding Spanish treasure ships. Colonies appeared in North America. The church had lost the heavens. England was taking the earth. The same act that began as a marital dispute quietly unlocked the global economy of empire. What's the biggest empire of belief today? From Wittenberg to Westminster, the pattern was strikingly similar. Luther had challenged Indulgences, the church's financial monopoly on guilt. Henry had seized its assets, the political monopoly on faith. Both men rewrote the balance of power, not primarily through war, but through credit, trust, and control. Luther's rebellion had given Europe moral permission to defy authority. Henry's had given it political precedent. Together, they dismantled the old order and replaced it with something new, a system where wealth and virtue were no longer opposites, but powerful allies. The logic of indulgences didn't die, it simply evolved. What the church had once sold as forgiveness, the new system sold as opportunity. Credit replaced confession. The printing press that had spread Luther's theses now spread stock certificates, manifestos, and investment schemes. The new priests wore merchant coats, and their sermons were written in ledgers. The world had simply traded one belief system for another. Faith in God became faith in money. The church had demanded obedience through salvation. Markets demanded it through scarcity. Both relied on the same invisible promise, trust. People once believed their coins could buy time in heaven. Now they believed their labour could buy freedom on earth. The illusion was the same, that salvation could be purchased, that effort could erase guilt, that wealth could prove worth. Where do you place your faith today? And like every empire before it, the new one began to believe in its own immortality. The church had claimed eternity. The market promised progress. Both built systems that required faith to function. Both demanded sacrifices, once on altars, now in offices. Both replaced introspection with obligation. The Reformation didn't end the economy of faith. It secularized it. The Vatican's indulgences became government bonds. The Pope's treasury became central banks. The tithe became taxation. The moral hierarchy of priests and bishops became the bureaucratic hierarchy of ministers and financiers. Every citizen now had a confessor, not behind a curtain, but in a credit score. By the 18th century, belief itself had become a commodity. Nations issued paper money not backed by gold, but by trust. The value of currency depended not on divine blessing, but on collective faith in the system. The miracle of transubstantiation had turned bread into body. The miracle of modern finance turned paper into wealth. Both required belief to work. And that is why Luther's hammer still echoes. His rebellion shattered the Church's monopoly on salvation, but it also unleashed a new kind of faith that would come to dominate the modern world. The Reformation didn't destroy belief. It reprogrammed it. It replaced prayer with productivity, penance with payment, eternity with compound interest. The Church once taught that virtue led to heaven. The market now teaches that success leads to happiness. Both are systems of hope built on the same architecture of obedience. 500 years later, the world still runs on that same logic. Governments print money like indulgences, promising redemption through stimulus and credit. Corporations market their products as salvation. And citizens still kneel, not in pews, but at checkout counters, on trading apps, in debt repayment plans. We've simply changed the language. But the faith remains, because the Reformation wasn't about God, it was about leverage. It was the moment humanity learned that whoever controls belief controls behaviour, and that the most powerful kind of empire docen. Need armies or cathedrals, it only needs trust. And trust, like faith, can be spent only so many times before it runs out. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.